who this is her fourth presentation with us, is Bryna O'Sullivan. And tonight is going to talk about house history. This is the second part. This is going to focus mostly on who's lived in your house and how to research that. Last time she focused on land records and doing research that way. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Bryna, once again.
Thank you. So let's get started. So we're going to be working through the different aspects of your home story tonight, starting with the literal history of your house, and then moving into who were your home's occupants and who were their neighbors, and then narrowing down to the story of your home's occupants themselves. In order to do that, we're going to work our way through a couple of different groups of resources. We're going to start with architectural surveys. Architectural surveys are often done to document historic homes. They are a combination of architecture and history, because if you've lived in this region or lived in another region for a long period of time, you'll notice that the region's architecture changes slightly over time, and there are certain features that correspond to certain time periods. Those features can help us date a building and understand how those who lived there used it. So this is our first architectural survey. The Historic American Building Survey was actually a WPA project. We'll look at the early version of it in just a minute. This is the oldest continuously operating project, I believe, of the Library of Congress, and it is still actively going. The fun part of using the Historic American Building Survey is that it allows us to search not only images, but also plans and other descriptions of buildings in our homes, communities, etc. So I went ahead and pulled up Rocky Hill, specifically because I know the Historic American Building Survey has a number of images for older buildings in Rocky Hill. This resource is fairly hit or miss. You're going to have different plans for different towns, different time periods. For example, this one is the Rocky Hill Congregational Church. And if you'll note the car in the lower left-hand corner, this is clearly not a contemporary car. This photo dates from 1938. Now, if we were to go back, we could actually keep going. And you'll note we have other images from Rocky Hill, including numerous of the Congregational Church. And then we also have things like the plans of the Congregational Church circa 1938. I'm going to go ahead and open one of the images so you can see what it looks like. And this is the breakdown of that particular building at that time. Now, the Historic American Building Survey is not just focused on commercial buildings. For the particular group of towns we were looking at, it is a little heavier on the commercial buildings. For Rocky Hill, we have the Rocky Hill Congregational Church. We also have the Academy Building. But if we go search Weatherfield instead, you'll discover that we have a number of images. Unfortunately, this also catches all of the images for the Department of Transportation, so be patient going through it. But here, for example, are some images of Wethersfield Cove circa 1940. Part of the fun of this search is not only are we getting details of the history of the building's construction, we're getting an idea of what it may have looked like for our ancestor who lived in the community or for the person that lived in our home. So the Historic American Building Survey is essentially the continuation of a WPA project, but we have access to the original records for said WPA project. In order to access those records, we're going to go to the Connecticut State Library website. You have the direct links for this in your handout, but I wanted to show you how to get there. So if you go to collections, ctstatelibrary.org, ctstatelibrary.org, collections, digital collections, content DM. So collections, digital collections, content DM. And then the last page, we're looking at something called the WPA Architectural Survey. So this was the survey that started the Historic American Building Survey. It was conducted between 1934 and 1937. And like the modern version of the Historic American Building Survey, it includes images, plans, and a lot more. So I'm going to go ahead and browse it. I'll see if I can pull in a couple of different locations this time. Be very patient. The ability to sort by town is a little bit difficult to use, so you may have to do a little bit of juggling to find it. So for example, go ahead and parallel up some of the Berlin buildings. And if you are very lucky, you'll be able to identify your property on site. But let's go ahead and look at this one just so we can get an idea of what's listed. So between 1935 and 1937, this property on Worthington Ridge Road was owned by Pardon C. Rickey. They believed at the time it was built in 1789 and it was remodeled in 1850. They believe the original owner was Blakesley Barnes. You'll note we have details about the doorway, the interior, the foundation, fenestration is the window description, and much, much more. Now, when they built the Historic American Building Survey website, they did not include all of the images in the WPA House Survey, the original format. So you're more likely to get original images from the State Library's collection. Why would you use the Historic American Building Survey? Because things have been added to that since 1937. The State Library's collection is essentially stuck in 1937. It is still an incredibly valuable collection. If nothing else, it tells you the construction of the home circa 1935 to 1937, or 1934, depending on the locale. And it also tells you what people knew about the ownership at that time. So clearly, depending on the time period, the details may or may not be accurate, but it's worth checking to find out. So before we move forward, I just want to remind you that you can put questions in the chat. I will be glad to try to answer them. Just to go back a page, so you're aware, on this WPA House Survey page, on the left of the page under Subject, you can sort by town, but you will have to be patient. The order really depends by town. So for example, the Cheshire listing starts with the town, whereas the Weatherfield starts with dwelling Wethersfield. I did go ahead and put the exact links into your handout to make it a little bit easier, but I just wanted you to get a glimpse of some of the other things that are available. So for example, this is a detail photo. From 251 Main Street in Wethersfield that at the time was owned by Comstock Ferrying Company. It was built in 1767, they thought, possibly 1753. Original owner was believed to be Simeon Belden. We again have the wood construction, etc. So yes, we have a note in the chat that there's been some work to ID the Berlin houses. Thank you for so doing. Be aware, this is the 1935 to 1937 info. There are updates to most of these, but this is an excellent place to start simply because it is so comprehensive. So any questions about the WPA House Survey or the Historic American Building Survey? close some windows to make this easier on all of us. And we are going to start next by delving into the National Register. So something to be aware of. If you see historic homes marked, there are multiple levels of marking. The Historic American Building Survey and the WPA Old House Survey didn't do any marking. It was done just as an informative piece of detail. What you'll see happen in communities now is you will have a historical society or other local institution mark historic homes. You will sometimes have the state mark historic homes, or you will have the property listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So as you'll see on this page, it was authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and it's part of a national program to preserve historic buildings and archaeological resources. People often will add homes for both the historic value, and there are some tax implications for protecting historic properties. So this is one of the ways that the Historic American Building Survey and the WPA survey were updated. This is linked in your handout as well, but I want to show you how this works. This search by state option allows us to search most of the historic register entries that have been conducted, I think, up till 2012. I'm going to go ahead and put in a location. And we'll see what we get. So this was the listing for the Rocky Hill Congregational Church. This is always a little bit slow to load, but it will offer you details as we get into it. So we have the location, we have the classification of property, the owner of property, legal description, where it's listed in existing surveys, historic overview, the architectural description, and then if we keep reading, we'll get all of the different places it was listed. So it was included in the Historic American Building Survey in 1942, the state level register of historic places in 1975. Unfortunately, that is not digitized. You'd have to contact the state office. And then it would go out from there. These surveys generally include both an architectural description and some sort of ownership description. So this can be a great way to learn more both about the construction of your building and also about who lived there. Now I'm going to close this one and I'm actually going to pull up Wethersfield. I'm doing that for a reason. If you ever get bounced out, and you can, go back a couple of pages and it will pull you back through. But I believe down here are the Wethersfield surveys. Now, why am I pulling up Wethersfield? Wethersfield is a bit of a unique combination, but this is something you want to check for every community you're dealing with. It is possible, and in some towns very likely, that there was a community level historic building survey that may or may not have led to a listing on the National Register. In Wethersfield, there definitely was. So this is the historic district. This indicates all the existing surveys, and then we get details building by building by building. Wethersfield Historical Society, I believe, has the initial surveys for this. You'll see pieces of this model working in other towns. Forgive me, I didn't think to confirm this till now. Berlin, you may have been caught in the Middlesex Historic Preservation Trust survey. So always check with your local historical society to find out if there is a local survey that may have led to this historic register listing, or in some cases was just done for the sake of information. So again, these are the national historic lists. These are the top tier of historic register possibilities. There generally is a local one. There is a state level one. Unfortunately, the state surveys for our area have not been fully digitized. And then we have the federal level one. This is the link to the federal. I believe it's up to date through 2012. Any questions? Definitely take a look at these and look at them closely if you think your property is listed. They're not always 100% accurate, but they have some great resources, and it gives you a starting point to do the research yourself and confirm or disprove what's being said. Okay, so again, the value of the architectural survey is twofold. It tells you a little bit more about the construction of your property, including the features that were unique to the time that it was built. And then it also tells you about someone in the chain that lived there. Usually they focus on the first builder, but you may get a major property owner, someone that was well known part of the way down, and for whom historic preservation value was established. We have multiple options when we're looking at surveys. So for example, you can start with the Historic American Building Survey, you can start with the WPA Old House Survey, or you can just move to the Historic Register. They do all give you valuable resources. Your property may not be listed on all of them. They may be on one, they may be on none, but check them all out. Any questions before we move forward? Okay, we're going to move to maps. Now, why on earth am I talking about maps? Well, anyone that's done land records research in the last week, 2 weeks, have realized pretty quickly that we have one really, really challenging part when we try to do land records research. Our properties in Connecticut have always had the neighboring properties recorded by the names of the neighbors. That works great if the buyer or seller only owns one property in town, but it can make title searching or searching the chain of your property a lot more challenging if the buyer or seller owns 3, 4, 5 different properties. If you know who the neighbors were, you can ensure that you're tracing the right property. You can also learn a little bit more about what the neighborhood would have looked like at that time, who was in what area, what buildings there were, so on and so forth. So this is UConn's Magic Historical Map Collection. What they did was specifically pulled Connecticut towns. This is not the easiest to use collection. It's a little bit clunky, so be patient with it. But it's a good way to begin your research process. So we're just going to walk through our options starting from Berlin here. I'm going to click on the image. And I can actually open it in Flickr. You do have to be very patient. If you click too hard, you'll actually bounce out of it. This is from 1868. And you'll note pretty quickly, not only do we have the business references, we actually have all of the homeowners one after another on the various streets. So if you are looking for a specific property, you should be able to fairly quickly locate it by the neighbors. Town Hall is all the way over here. And we could go out district by district. To get out of this, just click back. We're going to keep going down. Sometimes you may end up having to search this simply because there are multiple towns on some of these maps. I'm actually going to try to scroll down. We'll see how successful I am. As part of the reason I'm doing this is it gives you a pretty thorough view of what sources they have available. You'll note there are, for example, for Middletown, quite a few. There are other towns in which no information is available or only one map. And you'll note there's no posted map for Newington. So we're going to go ahead and just search it to get straight to the Rocky Hill map. Here is again 1868. Similar format, same atlas. If you know where your property was, you can work on locating the neighbors. Part of the fun here oftentimes is figuring out where a well-known neighbor actually lived. So for example, here's the Methodist Church, where this individual ran a hotel. Finally, let's go ahead and look at Wethersfield. Similar format, same atlas. And part of the reason I didn't catch this at the time, we don't have a separate map for Newington, is here is Newington. So this is one of our multiple possible options for maps. There were a number of atlases created around the 1868 period. There were also a number created in about 1890 to 1895. We're going to go ahead and search those by using the David Rumsey map collection. So let's go ahead and search Wethersfield, Connecticut on this one. And for example, here is one of those maps. This one is from 1893. We can click on the plus to zoom in. This 1893 map obviously has nowhere near the level of detail we saw earlier, but still you'd be able to use it to place some of the major institutions in town or the Connecticut State Prison. There are other atlases here as well. The 1893 map covers Rocky Hill and East Berlin. And there is, if you're really interested in historic interpretation, shall we say, a 1934 map of Old Wethersfield. Take this with a grain of salt. It reflects the period, including the racial attitudes of the time. But it is a fascinating piece of history. Any questions thus far? So maps are important because they help us locate the neighbors, and they can help us learn more about what was going on around our ancestors' home. They could also literally help us figure out what our ancestors' home was made of. So I'm going to close this and I want to show you a Connecticut State Library database. The Connecticut State Library has a slightly more complete version of this. I've provided the link to the Library of Congress version in your handout. Collections, databases, S, and you're looking for the Sanborn maps. So these were created between 1867 and 1970, and they were done as a way to estimate the cost of fire insurance. Their reason for doing that was they knew if they could figure out what homes were made of, they would have a better ability, shall we say, to judge fire risk and therefore be able to accurately appraise insurance value. What's the value for us? These maps, especially as we go forward, tell us what was on the property, what the homes were made of, what the names of neighboring businesses were. So DWG is dwelling. So most of these have a dwelling with something behind it. Here's the congregational reading room. I'm going to go up to 1927. This one is not colored, but some of them will be. Let me see if I can find one that is. Forgive me. I pulled this using the other version earlier. But you'll note as we go forward, we have these indexed key sheets because they get more and more detailed. And they'll actually, with some of them, have colors that represent the specific makeup of the building. So for example, here's the Stanley Chemical Company, the Berlin Construction Company, down to the point that we can see the main shop. And we could, for example, go look at another town. So let's go ahead and check out Weatherfield. And let's check out April 1930. Again, they use the same key sheet. The key sheet allows you to break it into smaller locales. So this will tell you what streets are on which page. And then you can use that to quite literally look at the street. So you note by 1930, we're dealing with subdivisions. So again, the value of the Sanborn fire insurance maps is partially that they allow us to see what's around, but in many cases, they also literally allow us to see what the home is made of. So do a little bit of digging. There are multiple versions of these, and they cover different time periods. The colored ones will literally contain the building's makeup. Any questions thus far? I'm going to show off one of my favorite collections, even though there is not specifically one for one of our towns. So if you've ever wanted to literally envision a town in the 19th century, this is kind of the only way to do it, but it's one of the most fascinating ways to do it. The panoramic map collection represents the late 1800s through about 1915. And what they would do was the artist would quite literally draw a bird's eye view of town. So let me go ahead and pull up Hartford just for the sake of doing so. I'm going to click into it. And I'm going to enlarge it further. So you'll note you can not only read the street name, you can quite literally see the buildings. So here's Front Street. Do a little bit of research. We see a factory in this area. And if we keep going, we'll be able to identify churches, businesses, and other details of the time, right down to the steamship on the Connecticut River. Now, this particular one was created in 1877, but these do exist for quite a longer period. I believe there's one for Middletown, which I will try to locate very briefly, from 1915, but here's 1917 in Waterbury. This is essentially the late 19th and early 20th century version of Google Maps. And look at the level of detail involved in this. So we have a church right here that we can literally see. So again, the value of these maps is not only the neighbors, but also seeing what your ancestors' world look like. I've included 2 other links on your handout. I just want you to be aware that they do exist. So the New York Public Library map collection is New York focused, but it includes US atlases. Some of them have maps of Connecticut. And then you have Yale University with a similar setup. They have multiple localized maps, such as railroad routes. Things that can also be useful for understanding how your ancestors' town worked or how your home's occupant may have moved around. Any questions at this point? Okay, so we have one other resource that can help us with seeing our home's existence through construction, through old photos, etc. The Connecticut Digital Archive is being run by UConn, but UConn is really just serving as the host. So what is happening with the archive is that different communities are posting digital material. There have been, for example, a number of old maps placed on here, a number of architectural surveys, a number of old photos. And it's definitely worth doing an open-ended search because you will discover that there is quite a bit that you would not expect on your property. So this is a Weatherfield Railroad right-of-way map from 1915. You could also, for example, go ahead and search Newington. Let me try to get out of the railroad valuation maps. There we go. We have more valuation maps because I didn't do it soon enough. So we had a question if there are maps available for Germany and England. The answer is yes. You'd be focusing on the larger map collections and also the Library of Congress website. So this gives you a pretty good glimpse fairly quickly of what's available. So if we look, we have those railroad maps. We also have a number of old photos. So for example, the railroad station in Newington in 1950. These are the architectural surveys I mentioned. This is a state level register application for a property in Newington. Let's go ahead and zoom in, see what it is. This is 303 and 305 Willard Avenue, Captain Jonathan Stoddard House. It's not open to the public. And we have a photo from the time period. This was filled out in 1966. So this is the state level historic preservation, which I misspoke earlier. I thought was not digitized. So definitely take time to go through here because you will find things you truly do not expect. Now, you also want to be aware if you're focusing on architecture or trying to learn more about your home by specific features, there are two reference books you want to take a look at. Both are on your handout. One is called Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. One is called A Field Guide to American Houses. Sometimes you can, when you're tracing your home, get your home back to a certain point in time and can't determine when it was constructed simply because there are too many other deeds, too many options. That's when looking at the specific features of the home can come in handy. The Field Guide to American Houses focuses on specific features such as chimneys, foundations, etc. The Connecticut Architecture reference looks more at architectural styles and dates when they were used in Connecticut. One of the things to be aware of, many of the standard reference works assume that Connecticut had the same styles at the same time as Rhode Island and Massachusetts. I guess more recent study has indicated that they were in fact somewhat behind. So be sure that you are looking at Connecticut specific resources if you're focusing on architectural study. So just to recap, I am approaching this in two ways because I know some of you are doing this because you're interested in a specific ancestor. Some of you are doing this because you're interested in your home. Either way, these are all useful to you. So if you look at the architectural surveys, you will get a history of the building, and you'll also get short histories of one or more of the occupants. You can look at multiple surveys. We have the Historic American Building Survey, which is run by the Library of Congress. That is an extension of the WPA Old House Survey. The WPA Old House Survey, which was run between 1934 and 1937, did a brief history and sometimes plans of what was known about that home at that time. Those have been digitized by the Connecticut State Library. The link's in your handout. We also have registers that were filled out either locally, on the state level, or on the national level. Local registers are usually held by the Historical Society in the community. The state level registers are held by the state. As we just noted, some of them have been digitized by UConn and are on Connecticut Digital Archive. And then we have this National Historic Register. The applications in that case are on the National Archives website up till, I believe, 2012. Please don't quote me on that, but it's fairly recent. People do them for a lot of different reasons, but you do want to make sure to check all of the possible options if you're trying to trace the history of a property, simply because you may have a case where someone did it locally and then realized they had a tax benefit for doing a national register application, and you have more information later. The more detailed you can be in your search, the more detailed you'll be able to be in the history of your property. Now, looking at old maps and old photos can help you build out the story of the property or build out the story of your ancestor. So, for example, if you want to focus on what your ancestors' world looked like, the old maps and old photos will help you do so. The older maps can help you also ensure that you are following the right title when you're researching your property. Now, again, if you end up with a dating question, be sure to take a look at the reference books I mentioned that can help you narrow things down, because the history of the architecture and the history of the paperwork don't always align. Now, if you are looking specifically at your own home and you've developed a list of owners and you want to know more about those owners, how do you proceed? Let's go there. Any questions before we do? So if you haven't already done so, the US Census is a great way to delve into the history of your home without doing a deep dive into the history of the people that live there. So I'm using the website familysearch.org. I should already be logged in. I just went ahead and pulled up a specific census here. If you are not familiar with this, again, you're going to create an account. Follow the instructions. This is a free site. You should not be prompted to pay. Once you've received an email confirmation, you can click on sign in and you'll be able to access this. I'm actually going to browse instead of searching just so you can see what's available. I go into Connecticut and then I'm going to go into Hartford County. Let me go ahead and pull up a little too far. There we go. Let me pull up Newington this time. Now, you'll discover with the earlier censuses, they do not consistently record street address. So you would have to focus on the homeowner's name. If they record street address, and they will later, it is along the side. But once you have the name, you quickly have a snapshot of the family. So for example, John H. Fish of Newington was the head of household. Born March of 1850, he is 50. He's been married for 28 years. His wife is the mother of 4 children. Given that he and his wife have been married the same amount of time, chances are good they're the parents of the same 4 children. And he is a coal and meat merchant. We can use this to delve deeper into his story. We can learn more about what his day-to-day life was and fill in many of the gaps. If you wanted to go deeper, you could look for birth, death, and marriage records. You'll know pretty quickly they have 4 children, but they only have 3 in the house. What happened to number 4? We can use that to try to fill in some of the gaps and learn more. If you're looking for those are also in Family Search. Catalog, place, and then it's reverse structure. So Connecticut, you want to put in the county, Hartford, and then put in the town. So vital records, and then you'll have them up through 1915. This is a really good way to get a really brief history of who was living in your house. Because from the census, you'll get a snapshot of who was there on a census year. Keep in mind the census is taken every 10 years. We have details on everyone in the house from 1850 up to 1940. Prior to 1850, all we'll have is the head of household and then numbers based on ages. We can also get an idea of the occupation of a homeowner and go from there. Now, the more recent censuses will have street address. The older ones, you will have to search by name. Once you have those names, you can fill in from vital records. Now, say you don't want to do all of this work. You have a backup option. This can get a little awkward in terms of ads, so please forgive me. The site has an open ad policy, but there is an excellent blog called Historic Buildings of Connecticut, and they literally profile buildings one step at a time. So for example, this is Danbury. And then you can click on index by town to see what they've profiled. Now, say you're back prior to 1850 and you cannot find those documents. What do you do instead? Look for town histories. You would be amazed how often you'll find a prominent ancestor or a prominent homeowner profiled in a town history. So the link to this is in your handout. But there is a publication called History of Ancient Weatherfield, which covers most of the towns in our group. There are multiple versions of this online because it's out of copyright. This is one of them. It was published in 1904. You click on the question mark. You can go ahead and search. So let's go ahead and search for Wells. So we know that was a prominent name in the area. This is often very slow, so do be patient. If you are truly stuck, you can page through by page. As it's loading, let's go ahead and open a couple of pages so you can see what they look like. So on page 43, we have a name that matches the Wells. And this actually follows an Adams family member who has a family member with a Wells first name. This is distorting just a tiny bit, but this gives us a full profile of Sherman W. Adams, Esquire, who was born in Weatherfield, May 6th. I'm not fully reading the year, but sometime in the 1800s. We have his wife's name. We have his involvement in the Civil War, so on and so forth. How can this come in especially handy? Keep in mind, people inherit land, and those inheritances don't necessarily show up in the deeds. So if you are truly stuck and you have part of the chain of title, check to see if they inherited that land from somebody else prominent in town. I've also run into this where the family had the minister's lease and it was in local history. It was not in land records. So again, this is the history of ancient Wethersfield. There is a link to this in your handout. If you're dealing with Berlin, you're going to have a little bit of a different story because not all of it came from Wethersfield, but there is a history of Berlin as well. You'll notice the first entries you get are for Amazon. Keep looking. There's usually a digitized version. So this is Catherine M. North's History of Berlin. We have her profile, forward, and then we could go in and read the index and read the details. So for example, we have the earliest settlers of town, Jonathan Gilbert and his family, or the North family, or the Wilcox family, which is obviously going to make a major impact in that area. Any questions? Well, if you haven't considered it already, you do not want to miss checking the local historical societies for details on your property. Manuscript collections, old photos, all of those make it to the historical society. They don't necessarily get digitized. I know I checked with the local historical society when I was doing a project recently. They had a series of about 8 photos from the late 1800s that they didn't even know the locations for. So if you're looking for your home, that's a great starting point because not only have you found a photo, you've also benefited them. I've given you the links to the historical societies in your handout. Now, what else can you use to fill in the gaps? How many times have you seen a great party profiled in the newspaper? The state library has a really good finding aid that tells you what newspapers were published when. ConnecticutStateLibrary.org. It's a little easier to go in from research, Connecticut newspapers. Be patient, you will get buried in here if you're not being careful. You actually want to look at newspapers of Connecticut, if I have the right link. Yes, I do. Click on Browse, and you can review what's available. If you go in directly from the link I provided, you'll actually be able to look up by town. So there are multiple newspaper options here. Play around a little bit, you'll get the correct option you need for what you're doing. This is the Find Newspapers link. Let's go ahead and pull up Rocky Hill. This is in your handout, you have the direct link for this. This tells you that there were no titles published in Rocky Hill itself, but there were titles published in Cromwell, West Hartford, and Wethersfield, all of which may cover Rocky Hill and can get you fun details like all of the parties that were held in your home in the 1920s. So again, for filling in the gaps, you want to start looking at who was living in your home at a specific time. And you also want to look at their stories. What were they doing? What parties were they throwing? What was happening around them? That can really help you build out details. Now, if you want to know more, delve deeper into their lives. Keep in mind, there are military histories. A little bit of a personal aside, my ancestors' military history gives me the 1915 name of the family property, which is no longer used and would not have been known. You also can check with people in your community. They often can tell you what used to stand on that property up and down the hill, what was torn down, why it was torn down, and more. So think about this as a story. Think about this as a way to build out history one way or another. If you're building out the history of your home, you're starting with the title, who owned it and when did they own it. If you are building out the history of your home, you're looking at the architectural details. What was added, what was removed, what was changed. That's where the architectural survey and the land records can come in handy. If you're looking at the world around your home or the world that your ancestors occupied, look at the old maps, look at the old photos. And then finally, fill in those gaps. Learn about who was living in your home. What was going on in their lives? Were they throwing great parties? Were they experiencing tragedy? Did they have a fire? Were they involved in preserving something important on their property? These are all details that you can fill in that really can tell your home story or your ancestor's story in a way that you may not have been able to in the past. And keep in mind, all of these principles can be applied to more than your home. I've seen communities use them to document historic barns. You can also document things like what used to be under the highway. Guess what? There were properties there. These are stories of your community that you can dig into and really fill out. So I've covered a lot of material very quickly. I do want to go ahead and allow you to answer questions or ask questions out loud. I'm going to stop share briefly just so I can see faces. But please feel free to go ahead and pose questions. Or share resources. I know we have some great resources available.
Feel free to unmute yourself at this point and talk if you have any questions or resources to share.
Or if you tried to do a land record search and ran into some problems, you are probably not the only one that had this issue.
I guess we have a quiet group tonight.
So some of the things you do want to be aware of as you're digging, think about the different options for filling in the historical narrative and where you can possibly access those. Often it's places you wouldn't think about.
Can I add something, Carrie?
Please.
Yes.
Okay. I'm Kathy Nelson, and I've been working with the Town Historical Society and the local history room at Berlin Peck to identify the older houses erected before 1900. So if anyone's working on those kinds of things, get in touch with Carrie and we can talk about the research that's ongoing.
Great. No, those projects are exceptionally valuable, not only for individual homeowners, but also just for telling the community's story. We've
Yes.
lost a lot in terms of historic preservation. If you lived in Connecticut prior to the urban renewal movement, Connecticut looked very different.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kathy, for that information, and feel free to get in touch with me, and I can work on getting you in touch with Kathy. And Bryna, thank you so much for this these 4 programs. We've learned so much from you, and the handouts are wonderful as well, so we can look back on things.
So if anyone has any questions that they weren't comfortable sharing in front of the group, please feel free to send me an email. I'll try to point you in the right direction. I put my email in the chat. And then we also had a request to upload the handouts again, just in case. Give me one moment, I'll do so. They should be in the chat right now. So any final questions?
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. If you wanted if you didn't receive the handouts through email from one of your libraries, you could just click on the link that Bryna just shared in the chat. We'll leave that up for a few minutes.